Hey everyone, this is Diane White, Executive Director for MMOPA. Glad to have you guys all here for another safety stand down. We started this concept last year, and the idea was that we could get together in person, live in different locations around the country. Unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, we've switched gears and we're trying to do more virtual webinar type events so that we can still bring you the great safety content we want to develop and present to you. But at least this way we're together, but at least virtually. So before we get started, just a couple things I want to touch on. Just to let you know, if you've not ever done a webinar before, your video and your microphone is turned off. If you have a technical issue where you can't hear us, you can send us a chat. We have a Josh Pack as our technical guru in the background. So if you have something, you can send him a quick chat and he'll help you out. If you have a question, throughout the entire morning, type in your questions in the Q&A function, and that way we'll keep track of those, and we may not answer it right away, but I'm watching those the entire time. So please put in your questions. We will stop between each session and answer questions. We have about 6 topics we're going to go through. It's really a lot of stuff, and it's going to be very fast paced. At the very end, we're going to do something kind of fun. It's going to be Ask Travis and Joe anything. So it'll be a chance for you guys just to ask any question that's on your mind. So that pretty much covers. And also at the end, I would like to ask you guys to take a quick poll, what you thought of the session. So we'll do the questions at the end. So here's the quick introduction to everyone that's going to be speaking this morning. So we've got Travis Holland coming on board with us today. I know many of you know him well. He is broadcasting today live from his classroom at the Bellingham Airport, where he is celebrating his 20th year as an active flight instructor. And around MMOPA, I guess we still call him the new guy, right? This year, he's had the good fortune of flying around the world, east and westbound, made 2 trips to the Middle East and back, 4 trips to Asia, including a recent trip to China that included 14 days in government quarantine. Fun times. Happy to be home, but he's heading back to Iceland today. After this is over, he's jumping right on a flight to do that. He's a MMOPA member emeritus and is the best guy to have in your corner, far from home. That's our guy, Travis Holland. Joe Casey, you all know him. He's a MMOPA board member and also chair of our safety committee. He's an instructor. He's an examiner, retired military pilot. He is an MMOPA lifetime member, and he just bought a Stearman, and he's about to buy a motorcycle, he tells me. Maybe this is some kind of midlife crisis. We'll have to find out more later. Flown to 12 countries since coronavirus became a household word, including Milan, Italy. All of his sons, all 3 of them are now finally out of the house this year, and he is very proud to announce he just got a raise. So we're very glad to have Joe with us today to present some of these great topics. So without further ado, I'm going to let Joe take it from here. The first topic we're going to discuss this morning is stabilized approaches. And as we thought this very carefully in terms of the order. I think you're going to find everything that's being presented kind of builds on itself. So I think it'll be very, very great for you guys. So Joe, if you'd like to come on, we'd love to have you take it from here.
Great. Okay. I assume you can hear me now, correct, Dan?
I can hear you.
All right. So this is Joe, and I'm glad to be here. This is kind of a fun new way of doing things, and I appreciate Diane and the MMOPA hierarchy allowing this to occur. So with no further ado, let's get it going. Okay, so, a lot of times we've wondered a long time in our MMOPA community about what we should do as far as what we call standard operating procedures. And I'll tell you, in the military, we've got standard operating procedures and we follow them to a T. Everybody does them, and it's very important that we do, because we got, shared multi-crew cockpits, and we have missions that are required where we just follow standard operating procedures. In the MMOPA community, we don't have multi-crew aircraft. We have single pilot aircraft. But yet there was nothing in our, I guess in our community that had anything that was remotely close to how do you do the work? How do you fly an approach? How do you fly this aircraft? Piper gave us a great aircraft, but how you do it was very wide ranging. And so as an instructor, I joined this community many years ago and found there too, I kind of had to develop my own. And and it worked, worked for me. But as time progressed, we wanted something that would be sort of like a recipe, sort of something how you could fly an approach, how you should fly your aircraft. And it was fun to be a part of because really a whole bunch of the MMOPA community joined that part to develop what ended up being standard operating practices. And it's kind of like a recipe. So let's talk about that for a minute. Now, if you're making cupcakes, which I don't do, but if you did, you're going to follow a recipe most of the time. And I've copied this recipe off. And you do this, you do that, you add these ingredients, you mix them together, you end up with a cupcake. And certain cupcakes are definitely going to be better than other cupcakes. And I mean, we got TV shows about cupcakes and how to make them. So cupcakes can be just a whole bunch of fun. But if you mess up a cupcake, no big deal. Everything's fine. But what if you mess up an approach? What if you mess up a flight? How does that look? What's the end result? And it can be a lot more dastardly. So what we end up doing is we came up with a recipe, if you want to think of it this way, for flying your approach. I mean, when do you put the gears down? When do you put the flaps down? How does this work? How does it look? And so what we ended up doing at MMOPA is we created we have a safety committee, and the safety committee basically was tasked with tackling this plan. And so we nugged it out together. There were 7 of us, a very nice group of people that all are flight instructors and within our community. And we really sat down and talked about, okay, how do you fly a piston PA-46? And we grouped the pistons together, meaning the Malibu, the Mirage, and Matrix M350 all together. And because it just made sense. And then we grouped the turbines together as far the non-M600. So the Meridian jet prop and M500, we grouped them together. And then the M600 has its own group because really the wing is different on an M600 and it's sort of flown a little bit differently than the others. But we wanted to have something so that you could follow a recipe, you could have a plan. And it was kind of fun in the sense that we didn't want to have a standard operating procedures because procedures tend to sound legalistic and tend to sound like if you don't follow the procedure, then you're going to be messing up. What we wanted to have was operating practices, OPs. And the OPs basically tell you how you go about doing something where you'll find rhythmical success. In other words, what's worked well for us in the past. And the things that have worked well for us in the past are our operating practices. And if you go onto the MMOPA website, the operating practices are there. And this is the operating practice for the Meridian jet prop in 500 and just how to fly a precision approach. And again, it's very logical and it works just about every time. And you can go through this and hopefully you're flying it. Hopefully your instructors are teaching you from this. They're using this as a way to be able to encourage you to fly your aircraft. And the question comes, if you're flying approach, can you deviate from it? And the answer is, of course you can. I'll give you for instance, if we're flying in an M500 on an approach and we have a 20 knot headwind, well, you can see if you look down that the recommendation is that you move your power to 400 pounds of torque. And if you got a 20 knot headwind, 400 pounds of torque may not work. It may not be sufficient. And what happens if you're flying an approach and you come down to 200 feet before you see the runway? Well, you don't have the final flaps in yet. Is that okay? And the answer is sure. You can just pull the power back and land the airplane with 20 degrees of flaps. So we didn't want to have it where it was a procedure where this is where you got to do it every time. We wanted to have practices that work, that where you find success, and then you can modify those slightly is what we're hoping. Not very far. We don't want you moving real far, but the idea is you can shift just a little bit if you need to. I'll give you, for instance, if you've got a very short runway, well, then you're obviously going to fly that a little bit differently at the very last, meaning you're going to have a little bit slower airspeed coming into land. Or again, if you're coming to the bottom of the approach and you have a 200 overcast, how are you going to add the last flaps? And we don't want to add the last flaps. And the reason why is we want a stabilized approach. So the operating practices, I'm not going to go over all the operating practices. What I want you really to do is go to the MMOPA website, find the operating practices, check them out, and then try to fly them. And what you're going to end up doing is flying a stabilized approach. Now, stabilized approaches are certainly a requirement for a safe, well, let me just put it this way. The FAA is very serious about us flying a stabilized approach, because when you fly a stabilized approach, you have a greater success, or a greater chance of success whenever you come down to land on the runway. But there's a lot of times that we don't fly stabilized approaches, and usually they're not very good reasons. And usually we're in a rush, and oftentimes it's ATC rushing you, or you're just in a hurry yourself to get on the ground. So being in a rush is something that definitely goes against the idea of a stabilized approach. And then a lot of times we're just simply not taught right at the very beginning. Somebody didn't teach you well at the very beginning to fly a stabilized approach. But a stabilized approach is where we're going to have a constant speed down on the approach. We're properly configured early in the approach, and we have a constant approach angle all the way down to the runway. And if any of those vary or change, you end up in a place where you just don't end up with a stabilized approach. And what I see a lot of times with recurrent clients or people that come to me is they'll fly an approach where they'll literally make changes to, like they'll add flaps 100 feet off the runway, or they'll dive down to the runway to go below their constant approach angle. And things of this nature are things we're trying to avoid. We're trying to be stabilized very, very early in the game. So, but probably the best reason, not the best reason, but a great reason to fly a stabilized approach is to fight for precision. And to me, really aviation's, I mean, it should not be exhilarating. If aviation is just exhilarating and just where it's just a whole bunch of fun in terms of your adrenaline's pumping, well, you're doing it wrong. Aviation to me is fun in part because you get to fight for precision, and the operating practices give you a chance to be able to know what the bullseye of the target really is, and then be able to go fly an approach or fly a takeoff or a landing or a pattern, a full pattern with precision. I'll challenge everybody here to do this in the next few days. Go get your aircraft, get the operating practices that are listed for a traffic pattern, and go fly the perfect pattern. Go fly a pattern that just looks exactly as it ought to look. And what you'll find if you do that is it's very, very difficult to fly that. And so I just think that it'd be a great thing for everybody to be able to do, and to be able to fly an approach, or to fly that pattern with precision. If you can be within 5 knots, or be within 50 feet, or land within 100 feet of your touchdown zone, that's just a whole lot better than it is, and very, very difficult to do in terms of flying it, and it will make you very, very precise. So I hope that everybody gives the operating practices a try, and hopefully it's something that you'll give a try real soon. Diane, back to you.
Hey Joe, question for you.
Yeah.
Someone asked this on the chat, but what is considered to be the max descent rate? As in San Diego, sometimes they leave you high, and this was actually a discussion that happened on the forum, I think, in the last few weeks. They leave you high crossing through San Diego airspace, coming into Henderson over the mountains from the south. So talk a little bit about max descent rate and how you can still maintain what you're talking about.
You know, maintaining a constant approach angle is what we're looking for sure. And I have flown that approach into Henderson many times, and you do come in high. I will tell you that, and there's a whole bunch of other approaches. I recently flew out to Steamboat Springs in Colorado, and where you have to have a steep approach coming in. There is a direct correlation to a steep approach, and in order to there's a greater percentage of doing a steep approach and messing up a landing. Basically, if you were crashing an airplane you're going to crash an airplane with a higher propensity on a steeper approach than you are on a normal glide angle, for sure. The key is to have a constant approach angle all the way down, to establish it and come down. We don't have anything on our aircraft to really tell you whether it's 3 degrees or 4 degrees, unless you're flying, you know, a WAS or a glide slope that has it at 3 degrees. But if you're, you know, at 3.5 degrees or 4 degrees, it's hard to establish that. And to say a rate of descent is very difficult, because rate is equated to time. And so to say, okay, I'm flying an ILS with a 600 foot a minute rate of descent is safe, and if you go to 800, it's not. That's just not accurate. I mean, if you have an engine out landing, which we practice a lot, the rate of descent is quite high, and the approach angle is quite high. The key is that you're intentional and that you have a constant approach angle in order to an intentional, steady approach angle all the way to the runway. And you certainly can do it at Henderson. It's certainly steeper, and you certainly want to be able to fly it with precision. But I can't say that there's a rate that's too high or an angle that's too high per se that I can give a number for.
So this is a great, I love that this Antonio asked a question. And I know a lot of you guys are putting your questions on the chat. If you could, love these discussions to stay over on the Q&A section. So if you can move some of this over, that'd be awesome. We can all see it. So this is a great one, Joe. The vector approach graphic for the Meridian mentions disconnecting the autopilot with a trim switch. Why?
Okay, well, I put that inside there, and the reason there's some autopilots where you have a trim switch and you have a LRB, a little red button. And on some of the autopilots, if you hit the trim switch, you turn off the muscle of the autopilot. And in all of them, if you hit the trim switch, you're going to turn off the muscle of the autopilot. And the idea behind it is that you still have your process data up, meaning that your flight director is still going to be up if you hit your trim switch. And on all the PA-46 autopilots, I'd have to think it through, but I believe it's the vast majority of them. There may be an outlier here or there, but the vast majority of them, if you hit the trim switch, you're going to leave the flight director in the present, where you still have some process data, even though you're flying. On many of the autopilots in the PA-46, if you hit the little red button, you turn off the process data and the muscle. The muscle in the brain is another way to think of it. Think of your trim as the muscle, and think of your brain as the flight director. Now, there are some that's not that's not the exact way. If you fly a G1000, you hit the little red button, then the flight director remains up. You have to literally hit the FD button to be able to get that to go off. But it's just a good practice within the to hit your trim switch, because it leaves the flight director up, and also hitting the trim switch leaves the yaw damper on. And so leaving the yaw damper on, it just makes it a little more comfortable. Incidentally, one of the flaws that I see in people that fly is that you should hit make sure the yaw damper's off. And I'd have to think it through, but I think it is all of the PA-46s. If you hit the little red button, the LRB, then that will turn off your muscle and turn off your yaw damper. And so you don't want to land the airplane with the yaw damper on, for sure, because it'll be a little more difficult, especially in a crosswind scenario, to keep it on the runway.
So Eric asked a great question. When solid IMC and lowering ceilings, I asked ATC for full approach, usually including procedure turns. It allows me to stay ahead of the plane and not feel rushed. I feel it reduces workload for me versus vectors to final. What are your thoughts, Joe?
If it does for you, great. it does get you in a position where you can slow down and be in an approach environment for longer. But I would get good at vectors to approach, because you're going to do the vast majority of your approaches are going to be vectors to approach. I would be able to do both of them without having a spike in heart rate or something of this nature. So I guess I have no problem with either one. But if you go to one of the more busy airports, you're almost always going to get a vector to an approach of some sort, either that or a straight in, where you may not be a vector, but you're going to go to a point where you're being vectored, or a point where that's more straight in. So if you have trouble with that, I would definitely work on that, but you should be able to do both of them.
You can ask for a longer approach from ATC as well.
That's true. Yeah, you could definitely do that. You do that into DFW or Atlanta or some of the big ones, you might get a long vector, but so be it.
So there's a discussion on the Q&A. Is there any concern about like you're having to hit the LRB? It's another step, right? You're gonna have to remember to do to make sure you get the yaw damp off, right?
Yeah, you should. It should be part of, in the airline world, and corporate world, it's a call out. You'd say something along the lines of 100 feet, yaw damper off. Somebody would say that and make sure it's done. It's a good practice to do in our world as well. One of the problems we've got is a lot of, or one of the areas of focus for MMOPA in terms of accidents is just simple ground accidents where people leave the runway, hit a runway light, have a directional control problem whenever they land. And you just simply never know if that yaw damper was on or off. Was it a factor in the equation? If you get in the habit of every time hitting that little red button right before landing, you're guaranteed your yaw damper is off. And it's just a good practice that a good habit you need to get in on every airplane you land, to hit that little red button right before you land.
Okay, one more question before we switch to the next topic. Bill Air mentions the ILS 28 right at Montgomery Field in San Diego has a short runway landing beyond the glide slope, 2,600 feet. Do you reduce the airspeed and increase flaps while IMC on final? And Travis, feel free to jump on too.
Yeah, I've never flown that particular approach, but let me say this. Usually if you have an ILS or a WAS approach going to a short runway, your minimums are going to be higher on that particular approach. I would definitely want to be configured prior to, I would want to be configured, let me put it that way. The threat of going to full flaps in any of the PA-46, any of the PA-46s, is that it makes the go around more difficult. They'll all do it. You can fly a go around with full flaps on any of them, but it definitely makes it where the flying of that approach or the flying of that missed approach is more difficult. Just less margin because you have so much added drag. So we have recommended that you don't go to full flaps from 20. We recommend 20 degrees because that's going to initiate the gear warning. If you go to 20 degrees of flaps and you don't have 3 green lights, then you're going to get a warning. And we want that warning to come on to signify that you don't have the 3 green lights. We also don't want you going to 36 degrees of flaps in the operational practices, because I'll go around. We want you to have reasonable assurance that you're going to land the airplane and then go to 36 degrees of flaps. So if I were flying that short approach into that runway, I would definitely want to have full flaps going in. And I would this is where I would deviate from the operational practices. And in other words, we didn't want them to be procedures that you had to follow. We wanted to be a guideline. This would probably be one of the areas where I would want to have those 36 degrees of flaps and have that stable speed, a slower speed. In other words, if you're in I think he said meridian, with full flaps at 400 pounds of torque, you're going to be at about 90 to 95 knots. And that's a good speed to be, you don't want to pop out at 200 feet and then try to slow down to that on the short runway. It's just not going to end well. So on that particular scenario, I think that's one of the areas that I would change just a little bit and make sure that I had full flaps and was on speed approaching that shorter runway. Travis, you got any thoughts on that one?
I'm always extra cautious with short runways and low clouds, and I'm always thinking where my nearby alternates are in that scenario. I will do that final approach there with Montgomery full flaps, but I'm looking for 500-foot ceilings, not the 250 on the approach plate.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%.
Well, thanks, guys. Let's moving on. Travis, I'd like to kick it over to you. And I think the topic you would like, we're going to jump into next is a flight path marker and how we can use that more effectively, and that it's much more than just a bullseye to put on the end of the runway. Let you take
one
it
of
from
my
here.
favorite topics. Thanks for having me today. Good morning, everybody. Let me get my screen shared here appropriately. All right, so we've all used the flight path marker to handle the homing to the end of the runway on the synthetic vision, but there's so many great purposes for this flight path marker besides that. I thought we could discuss a few of them today. So the first is this concept that what is angle of attack? Angle of attack is the deck angle of the airplane, the pitch attitude, against the flight path, the physical movement through space. So here's a image from Private Pilot 101. Here's one that shows the symbology. So in this picture, this fighter jet is mushing quite a bit. Its pitch attitude is several degrees above its flight path. The delta between those two is the angle of attack. So here we're looking at a picture. We can see the flight path marker is on 0, but the pitch bars are up around a little over 5 degrees. Okay, so we're looking at angle of attack in this image. All right, so the first thing we're going to think about using this flight path marker for is for recapturing our lateral and vertical course without overcorrecting. Okay, one of our big challenges when we're flying inside the final approach fix is to avoid making too big of inputs and deviating from our course. So I've got a picture here. This shows the aircraft. If you look at the flight path marker a little bit to the right of the synthetic runway, right now we're deviating to the right. However, if our course was a little bit to the right, this would be a perfect wind correction angle or drift correction angle to go re-intercept the course from left to right. If we're a little bit low on the glide path, and in this case, you can see we're just a hair below the glide path, then moving that pitch or the flight path marker up so that it's above 3 degrees will result in the aircraft gaining altitude on the glide path. So one technique we can use if we're a little bit high coming in, we broke out of the clouds, is put that flight path marker just below the synthetic runway. This will result in a descent that it'll be a steeper than required descent to the threshold, which will allow us to then reduce that descent angle to around 3 degrees once we get the synthetic runway up where we want it. The next thing is this transition from IMC to VMC in crosswind situations. It's very common, we're coming out of the clouds and we break out with a crosswind, we see the runway off to the right, we turn the aircraft over to the right. What we want to do is cross-check our flight path marker on the end of the runway and make a small turn towards the runway as the crosswind reduces. And that way we get a nice clean track in as opposed to wandering back and forth across the course. The next thing is, and I see this a lot, I'm sure Joe does too, in visual maneuvering, there's a tendency to let the nose drop and get kind of excessive descent rates. So we've all done the steep turns where we put that flight path marker right on the horizon line, altitude not change at all. But when we're making visual turns in a traffic pattern, if we cross-check that flight path marker, what we want to avoid is anything steeper than this. This right here shows a 500 foot per mile or 5 degree descent angle. And that's probably about the maximum comfortable descent angle when you're visually maneuvering the airplane. Anything steeper than that, the plane's going to unwind pretty quick and you'll end up getting sink rate and terrain warnings, as well as maybe scaring your wife from wanting to fly with you as much. So you know, one of the biggest things I see observing other people fly when they're hand flying is really excessive descent angles on the turn. So this 5-degree guardrail, just a great way to help keep the airplane from getting out of hand while we're visually flying it around. Okay, the next thing is terrain clearance on departure and climb out. If the flight path marker is clearing the terrain, the aircraft's flight path is also clearing the terrain. And I looked for a great photo. I didn't find a great one, but in this picture, you can see that the synthetic terrain is underneath the flight path marker. There's blue sky between the flight path marker and the terrain. This means that the aircraft's extended flight path is going to clear the terrain in front of you. The last thing is we're often tasked on SIDS with a certain feet per nautical mile climb rate. And it's common practice in these PA-46s not to climb them at 110 knots, but to climb a little faster, 115, 125. One of the things we need to make sure, especially when we're IMC, is our climb gradient adequate to ensure compliance with the standard instrument departure. So 1 degree on the flight path marker is 100 feet per minute. 106 if we're talking with Paul Sanchez, but 100 for me and you. So we can verify during our flights, let's see if I can find this, shows a 2.5-degree descent angle right here. So if that flight path marker is up on the 2.5 line up, we're climbing at 2.5 degrees or 250 feet per nautical mile. So this can be a great use of the flight path marker to ensure compliance with our standard instrument departures. Lastly, angle of attack and stall prevention. The delta between the flight path marker and the pitch attitude shows our angle of attack in real time. VY in our PA-46 aircraft is about 2.5 degrees pitch attitude above the flight path marker. Okay. VX is about +5 degrees. A stall, whether we're in a bank with flaps 10, 20, or 36, the delta between the flight path and the pitch attitude in the stall entry of this airplane is about 10 degrees. So we can use this to give ourselves some confidence when we're flying, say, in icing conditions. If you keep the maximum mush or angle of attack below 2.5 degrees, that's the yellow pitch bars above the green bullseye. If we keep that to 2.5 degrees or less, we're keeping ourselves in a safe place operating in icing conditions because we're VY or better. So the only exception to these ability to read flight path pitch attitude to equal angle of attack is in mountain wave. In mountain wave, we can get the whole entire aircraft sinking against the datum plane of the Earth without angle of attack consideration that matches. But in all other cases, this is just great information directly in your primary field of view while we're flying. So the primary duty of the pilot in command is to maintain the safe flight path of the aircraft. If we've got the flight path marker, we got one less excuse for not doing a good job at it. Any questions?
Hey, I got a question for you before you get too much further, Travis. Do you fly, if you've got a tough approach, let's say 300-foot overcast or something, you're going into Iceland, and are you using the flight path marker, or are you using the autopilot, or using both? How are you doing it?
So in that scenario, I'm probably coupling up with the autopilot, and I'm monitoring the autopilot's performance by careful monitoring of the flight path marker.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I find that if I'm flying an approach, I can probably fly it better myself with the flight path marker than I can, that I'll do a better job with the flight path marker than the autopilot will do. And that's even with the GFC 700 and some of the really elite autopilots. I mean, if you really get good at the flight path marker, you can nail an approach. I mean, just you can fly within the width of a needle if you're good and you get practice with it. Do you agree?
Yeah, and the best autopilots are reacting to the situation, and the flight path marker allows you to be proactive. You can lead. You can maintain the center line of that course without any deviation of the needles that otherwise an autopilot would need. You know, I watched the Garmin autopilot. It goes a couple pixels below the glide path, then goes a couple pixels above the glide path. But when I'm flying, I can nail it because of that flight path marker.
Hey, can I throw in two more things here? Number one, I teach a lot. Use the top of the flight path marker or the bottom of the flight path marker to make a little change. Like, in other words, let's say you're a little left to center line, then put the right side of the flight director on one corner of the runway. Or if you're off by 50 feet, just put the bottom of the flight path marker on the white line, and it'll slowly, ever so slowly bring you, but assuredly bring you up. And I found that to be really, really, that's how I teach that. And boy, it just seems to work out well. You doing the same thing?
Yeah, it's the magic of allowing you to make very small corrections that have a result over 5 or 8 or 10 seconds, instead of making that abrupt correction, which gets you where you want to be in 1 second, and 1 second later you've gone through and you're in a spot you don't want to be again. So those subtle changes.
And then one other thing.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, one more thing I want to throw in, just because I love this thinking flight path marker. I think it's just awesome. If you have an engine out scenario, and you can train this if there's any instructors out there, you can train this by putting if you have a nice autopilot with airspeed hold, you can put the airspeed on 110 knots, be up at high altitude on a clear day, and put it on airspeed hold, and put it on 110. The autopilot, or it'll hold that, and then put a power setting. Let's say it's a turbine, or what would be a neutral power setting, so about 170 pounds of torque, or about a little higher than idle in a piston, and the airplane will obviously begin a descent. But then you can do things. You can add flaps or add the gear and watch the flight path marker. And as you add the drag, the flight path marker will go down. And what you can then do is use that flight path marker in simulating an engine out scenario to show the pilot how adding drag and releasing drag allows you to control your approach angle to a runway. And boy, I'll tell you what, if you get good at it, you can, in an engine out scenario, and I'm not suggesting you fly an engine out scenario with the autopilot, I'm suggesting that you train in that manner. But if you fly airspeed with your yoke, and then use your drag factors to control where the flight path marker goes, you can fly a very, very precise approach, engine out type approach. And we do it a bunch, and I just love that thing. I think it's just awesome.
Yeah, I got this picture up here, if I can get it shared. The PA-46 will fly clean about 4.5 degrees flight path angle at an engine out scenario. So as long as your runway is kind of below this 4.5 degree mark that you see on this flight path marker here, you can make that runway until you start dirtying up. So using that flight path marker to determine your descent angle is just a fantastic tool.
Absolutely. Hey, let me throw one more thing on there as well, because I have a good number of clients that have a G500 or similar, and they don't have synthetic vision. And I encourage everybody to go buy synthetic vision for 2 reasons. Obviously, if you live in the mountains, or that's a big deal. If you live in a place with a lot of terrain, it's a windfall of good information. But if you don't have synthetic vision, you don't get the flight path marker. So go get synthetic vision if you don't have it.
So I'm curious, you guys, everybody watching, you have a raise hand function. So how many of you use the flight path marker on a consistent basis? Can I see a show of hands? Wow, that's great. We've got, we'll keep numbers are climbing. So this is good. I would like to see obviously love to see that number even higher. So I think it's a very awesome tool, and it's just another very great safety device we all should be using. So if we're ready to change gears again, guys, everybody with us? Everybody and having a good time this morning?
Is there any field questions for Travis on that one?
I don't see any additional questions. Here's one from Jimmy Stallings. Will ForeFlight synthetic vision work with this too?
Yes and no. It's the same limitations of all the ForeFlight attitude indication, is that it does a lot with how the iPad is mounted in the aircraft and movement. But it's certainly better than nothing. So don't keep an eye on it. you know, on the Garmin 500, having the PFD right in front of you and the flight path marker, it sure makes it it's a nice place for cross-checking. But if you got your iPad mounted appropriately, yeah, keep your eyes open on it for sure.
I found that the Garmin flight path marker is outstanding and easy to follow and incredibly useful. You also have a flight path marker on an Aspen, and I don't find it as useful. I find it a little bit slow and hard to follow, and hopefully the Aspen guys aren't going to throw me under the bus for that, but I fly all of them. I even have an Aspen in my aircraft, and we're about to change that out just because I want to get the flight path marker in there. So.
Excellent. Well, ready to move on to our next topic, which is very appropriate because I'm sitting here while it's thunderstorming right where I'm at. Having spent most of my life in Tornado Alley, I was certainly very respectful of thunderstorms and convection, but there's always more to learn, and I think we're all students of weather as pilots. So I'd like now to kick it over to Joe. Would take us through a presentation on thunderstorms and what we might learn as we apply it to our flying.
So the question is, where did the water on the outside of those beer bottles come from? And it turns out that whenever I'm given a check ride, I ask a lot of questions with a bottle of water sitting on the desk, you know, where I'm sitting, and there usually is a bunch of water on the outside of them, and obviously that water condensed onto the bottle, and which begs a lot of questions. It's just a whole bunch of questions that can be asked from that position. And the same question comes from the water that's on your skin. And the question is, why is that water on your skin? And it's obviously sweat. We have millions, literally millions of sweat glands in our skin that secrete water out onto our skin. And the question I'll ask a lot of people is, okay, if your body, obviously you're going to sweat whenever it's hot. But when your body's hot and you secrete water, perspiration out onto your skin, that perspiration is going to be 98.6 degrees, or whatever your body temperature happens to be. And that water then gets on your skin. How is it cooling your body? And for the longest time, I just thought, well, the water on your skin cools your body because the presence of the water. But I guess I was playing hooky during 8th grade natural science. But if I was playing hooky, I think there's a whole bunch of other people playing hooky too, because I didn't understand how that water cooled my body. And the answer to that water cooling your body is that water evaporates. And again, I never really understood that, and I never really understood why that's important and why that works. And the answer is, whenever that water evaporates, the process of evaporation takes heat from your body and transfers it to the atmosphere. And that process of evaporation is required. And as everybody from the southern United States can tell you, if the air is real humid and there's not much evaporation going on, well, there's no cooling going on. And if you got a dry atmosphere or a wind, everybody's been out. If you've been in the southern United States, you've been outside and there's hardly any wind, and you're sweating profusely doing work or whatever, and then you catch a little breeze and it just feels so good. And the question is why? Is because, well, there's evaporation that's occurring there, and the process of evaporation. Last week I was up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and it was 98 degrees. And I remember when I left Texas, it was 98 degrees. And when I landed in Salt Lake, it was 98 degrees. But it felt 100% completely different because it felt just lovely in Salt Lake City. And one of the locals there said, yeah, everybody comes here for the winters, but they stay for the summers. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, because it was just so much nicer than Texas as far as the humidity is concerned. And where does this, and where you may be wondering, where am I going with this? And I am going somewhere, so hang with me. A little bit of 8th grade natural science discussion here. But if you got 3 states of water: solid, liquid, and a gas. And what happens is, and you can see all the different freezing and melting is a solid to a liquid. Everybody knows that. Liquid to a solid is freezing. And evaporation is liquid to a gas, and gas to a liquid is condensation. And then, of course, the one that everybody forgets about and doesn't understand very well is sublimation, which is bypassing the liquid state and going from a solid directly to a gas. We get that a lot. And if you've ever had frost on your vehicle of your car or the windshield of your airplane, you know about the vapor, water going from depositing or going through deposition and becoming a solid. So, if the temperature and the dew point are below there or below freezing. But the area I want to talk about right now is this condensation. We just talked about evaporation and how the state of gas is a less ordered state. And what I mean by that is whenever you have evaporation, then that is releasing the heat from your body to the air. And that release of heat is the critical factor that's happening. Well, the critical factor in a thunderstorm is this condensation that occurs. It's right here. And there's also there's also release of heat whenever you have freezing, but it's much, much less. The condensation is the big, gigantic game changer. And whenever you go from a gas condensing to a liquid, you're now going to bring heat into that situation. So, from the atmosphere, it goes into that situation. So the condensation of that more ordered state from a gas to a liquid, and adds heat. It adds what you'll read about, latent heat. Now, just that right there, I can tell you, I didn't really understand that. It never really gathered, that never really meant much to me until I started thinking about it more and started wondering how all this goes. But I'll tell you from giving a gob of check rides that I think that the percentage of people that understand this is really, really low. And so if this is basic to you, great. It's a good reminder. And if it's not, then hopefully you kind of get it out of this. So, because the question is, where does the thunderstorm develop its danger for a pilot? And one of the big things is this transfer of heat or of condensation is what propels the thunderstorm to generate the power that it generates. So let's look at that a little bit closer. If you look at a thunderstorm, and let me say this as well, as I've prepared for this lesson, it has been just a bunch of fun for me because it allows me to dig deep into this. And as I dug deep into this subject, I found what I thought I knew, and I did know a lot, but I found that this is a very deep well, a very wide body of information. I mean, the more you dig, the deeper it is, which just makes it a bunch of fun to study, in my personal opinion. So let's talk about that cloud. That cloud, let's pretend like it's 20 degrees on the ground and the dew point's 14 degrees, just for fun. We'll just take a day that just happens to be that day. Well, generally speaking, the air is going to cool at what we call the dry adiabatic lapse rate, which is about 3 degrees per 1,000 feet, somewhere in that ballpark. And so if we start at 20, as that parcel of air rises and it's going to get up to about 2,000. And obviously easy math, 20 minus 14 is 6. So at about 2,000, you're going to hit a place where condensation can occur because the temperature equals the dew point. Now, when that occurs, inside the cloud itself, you're going to get condensation. And at that point, the air is now not going to rise at 3 degrees per 1,000 feet, but inside the cloud, it's going to change at what we call the moist adiabatic lapse rate, which is a ballpark 1.5. I will tell you that number changes. That can be a much wider range than the dry adiabatic lapse rate, all a function of how much moisture is in the atmosphere. But if you have the moist adiabatic lapse rate where basically lots of latent heat is brought into that cloud, what happens is as the altitude goes up, the drop in temperature is less. Now, what that means is that hot air always rises. And so inside the cloud itself, latent heat through condensation is brought into that cloud. And now the cloud is going to want to rise. So we end up with what we call buoyancy. And just exactly like you say, in other words, that air wants to rise or wants to float. It wants to go up. And the reason why is inside that cloud, it's warmer. And above that cloud, it's cooler. So there's a tendency for this cloud to rise up. And it rises up. And how fast does it rise is the function of how big is the temperature change within the cloud versus above it. So there are days where the temperature decreases very rapidly above the cloud. And so you end up where the cloud always has a chance of being warmer as it goes up. And as that occurs, it's a whole lot like putting a basketball in the bottom of a swimming pool. So I've got 3 boys. One of them's young and 21 and in shape and healthy. And so I challenged him with the ability to swim down and put a basketball in the bottom of the pool. And we found out real quick that he could not do that. And I couldn't either. But we also found if he gave him a 50-pound weight and put it in his one hand, that he would very quickly be able to go down to the bottom of the pool. And when he released the basketball, this is what it looked like. There you go. Not very exciting, but there it is. That's the best description you can get of a thunderstorm, meaning that you have a less dense parcel of air below, and it rises very rapidly up through and brings that water up with it as it goes and continues to rise. I will also tell you that although I didn't think of it, but the 50-pound weight in his hand was a whole lot like descending air, like we've heard of where you get a descending column, a microburst or descending column of air. It's just where you get very dense air and it falls very rapidly. And that's just like that weight that drug my son down to the bottom of the pool. And I'll tell you, we had a blast doing this because it was a serious workout to bring that 50-pound weight up via swimming to the top of the pool. And it was really hard to get that basketball to the bottom of the pool. It took energy to be able to do that, to bring that weight up and to push that ball down. That energy transfer is what we're talking about that's happening. And I'll tell you, I've studied this and I was amazed. At any given point, there's going to be as many as 2,000 thunderstorms occurring across the globe, just at any point. And there's 30,000 plus thunderstorms each day all over the world. So we're talking about, I mean, with over 11 million storms happening every year, we're talking about a lot of thunderstorms. And the United States is one of the places that has a gob of thunderstorms compared to some other parts of the world. So of these 30,000 that are happening every day, we get a lot of them right here in the United States. And NASA satellite research indicates that these storms produce lightning flashes about 40 times a second. So this is, for us to be able to say, we're just going to avoid thunderstorms, we'll just never fly an air that ever has a thunderstorm in it, is, you're not going to fly very much, especially if you live in the Southeast United States. I mean, you might if you live in, an Arctic area, or you might if you live in, Seattle or something. Travis probably didn't have to deal with those nearly like we do down in Texas. But if you're going to fly PA-46 aircraft, which are cross-country airplanes with good range capability, you're going to be flying it somewhere where there might be a thunderstorm. So dealing with them is something we're all going to be able to do. So what happens with a thunderstorm? And the answer is we live in the troposphere. And this, you can see the temperatures that are at the bottom here, they get very cold. And this is just an average where the temperature begins to go down as you go up in altitude until you hit this thing called the tropopause. Now the tropopause is kind of like, using my basketball analogy, is kind of like the top of the pool, meaning that whenever the basketball hits the top of the pool, there's no more buoyancy. It doesn't have a tendency to rise anymore. And that's the same exact thing that happens at the tropopause. And the reason is this curve in the line. This curve in the line occurs at the tropopause where there's not much of a decrease in temperature. And so inside the cloud, because it doesn't get colder above the cloud, tends to not rise. And their thunderstorm looks a lot like this, where it'll grow up and then all that moisture gets funneled up and then it has nowhere to go. So it just fans out into what we call the anvil. And then above that is the stratopause, and then there's the mesopause that's just way on up there. But all of our weather effectively is going to happen right down here in the tropopause, which is about 36,000 feet. Now, I'll tell you, it's kind of a function of latitude. And the more southerly you are, or the more closer you are to the equator is probably a better way to say it. The closer you are to the equator, the higher the tropopause, and the closer you are to the poles, the lower the tropopause. But where we live in the United States, 36,000 feet is just a good average to think about that tropopause. So, and I say that to say, if you hear of a thunderstorm that goes above the mid-30s, you know you got a thunderstorm that's really, really impressive, because the thunderstorm doesn't want to grow above that. But if the velocities are throwing the air and the moisture above 35, 36,000, you know you've got a real mega thunderstorm that's going on. So a thunderstorm looks like this. And let me say this as well. My favorite geek out weather website is the weatherprediction.com. Man, I just love that website. It is, and I can definitely geek out on weather. I'm weird that way. But man, the guy that writes that is on it, and he's kind of writing not from an aviation standpoint, but from a weather forecaster standpoint. So it can get kind of technical sometimes. But gosh, what a great bunch of information that goes on there. But if you're inside the belly of the beast, a supercell structure, a really big thunderstorm, you're going to have these updrafts that move inside the storm. You're going to have these really cauliflower looking tops that are growing above. We call this the overshooting top, because it's past the tropopause, way up at 30-something thousand feet. You're going to then have these strong downdrafts that occur that are all happening together. And you end up with a storm that is just immense in its capability. Matter of fact, I read this one too, that the average thunderstorm has about the same amount of energy release as was on the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it gives you an idea of how powerful these are. And what we're talking about here is a megastorm, or supercell, and these are unbelievable amounts of energy that are released inside these. And so you end up with all of these problems at the bottom: a rain-filled base, a large hail, small hail, heavy rain, moderate rain. All kind of things are happening inside this thunderstorm that are no bueno for you. So there's a bunch of threats that go with a thunderstorm, obviously, and one of them is hail. And I have a customer, a PA-46 this year, went between two fairly small cells. It's and I won't mention names, but that customer basically had all of his boots that were damaged. The windshield was not broken, like cracked open. It didn't lose pressurization, but the windshield got pock marks on it. And he just flew between two cells that he thought he was clear from, and that everything was fine, but it didn't. The hail was thrown from the storm. And so he had some pretty serious damage occur to his airplane as a function of this. So you don't even have to go in the storm to get the dangers of the hail. And I found this to be very interesting. The velocity of an updraft required to force hail upwards. Look at the size of this. If it's just BB size, you're looking at a 24 knot wind updraft. And then you can see how to hold a nickel size hailstone is a 40, that's an updraft, a straight updraft. And so if you were to fly into that, it literally would, the lift increase would be so severe that it would literally rip your wings off, which it does. And I'll show you that in just a second. The threats with a thunderstorm is, one of them is lightning. And I wanted to say this as well. I've caught a little bit of grief in the MMOPA forum and a few other places just for being the guy that is not a huge fan of radar in terms of, I am a fan of radar only if you know what you're doing. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that you don't want to just avoid the thunderstorm itself and fly next to it. You want to avoid that storm by 20 miles. because lightning can emit from the storm 20 miles. The severe turbulence inside the storm, it can be absolutely deadly, literally rip your airplane apart. And I'll show you pictures of that. The icing inside of a storm is, it can be clear icing and severe, and terribly impacting the performance of your aircraft. And microbursts near the ground. One of Manny Cassiano does I'll give him a quick shout out, does a super job of producing the accident reports at our convention. I'm sure he'll do it at our next one, which is coming up real soon. If y'all didn't know that it'll be a digital version, but it's going to be excellent. Anyway, Manny talks, there was discovered at one of the accidents out in the Western United States had a microburst that occurred with it. It was a fairly small storm, but still the microburst was there. And here's the bottom line. All the evils nature can possibly throw at you, they're all rolled up into one thing, one storm. And you just got to respect a thunderstorm. If you want to look at the poster boy for bumbling into a thunderstorm at 709 Charlie Hotel, happened about a year ago, took off from Florida, flew northbound and flew into that cell right there. And this is the picture that comes from what we believe, or what is believed to be what the storm looked like when he bumbled into the storm. And there's a lot of factors as to why he bumbled into the storm, we believe as well. But we don't get to talk to anybody because everybody on board that aircraft is deceased, because literally it took the wings, where there's the wings on a PA-46 have 3 sections, and it literally broke the wings off at where those sections are, and rendered that aircraft completely unflyable. Terribly, terribly sad event. That was about a year ago. More recently than that, we had Malibu 43668, so 1984 Malibu out of Texas. But it's unsure exactly what happened, but they flew out of Columbia, South Carolina, and flew along this, like what appeared to be a nice little alley. But there was also a fairly steep area of convection. Lots of radio talk was going on here. There's some questions of what all happened, but clearly convection was a part of the end story, but it produced a fatal accident as well. So the thunderstorms definitely cause a lot of grief for us in the PA-46 community, for all of aviation, every bit of it, and we are simply not immune from that. So in the PA-46 community, we pretty much have one way of getting around it, and that is, here we are. One way of getting around it to assure protection, the only option you've got is avoidance. The only way you're going to be able to survive a thunder. You won't go under it. You won't go, you won't go over it ever. Going around it and potentially under it, although I'm not going to recommend that too much either, but going around the thunderstorm is going to be your only protection that occurs there. Let me get back up here. Get back to my computer. So the thunderstorm is something that we just have to avoid. If you were to bumble into a thunderstorm, I'll tell you one of the best lessons I've ever heard is John Mariani, which is a fabulous teacher. I respect John so much as an instructor. He has a wonderful discussion on maneuvering speed and what to do in a thunderstorm. And the answer, the biggest thing that you need to do in a thunderstorm, all that boiled down into one thing, is slow down. Your enemy is lift whenever you get into severe turbulence. And the lift is what will cause the wings to, excessive lift will cause you to have structural failure. So slowing down inside the thunderstorm. And there's other things to do as well. And if you were to bumble into a thunderstorm, but the big takeaway is just avoid the thunderstorm. And I'll leave this discussion with I've got a good customer of mine he's got a nice Meridian. I really like him. And he flew in the Western United States very near a very small thunderstorm. It was just like a shower almost, but a bolt of lightning hit his airplane, and the mess that he had to deal with coming out of that It was a whole bunch of downtime, a seemingly innocuous bolt of lightning, but it was years after that occurred until his airplane finally began to operate without gremlins, little things happening. They had to demagnetize his engine. They had to do all kind of maintenance work. And, but that Meridian's had all kind of troubles because it got hit by lightning. So my point behind this is you don't necessarily have to fly in the thunderstorm, which if you did, you would never do it again. Without a doubt, it would be just horrible. But if you did, if you don't even have to do that, just being near one can hit you with hail or lightning or severe turbulence. I just want to emphasize with everybody, I hope everybody comes away from this with the idea of avoid the thunderstorm. Now, I am going to talk a little bit later. The last lesson I want to give today is going to be on radar. We'll give that a little bit. And I am going to go over radar and talk about how to use that onboard radar to help and use the downlinkable radar to help you avoid the storms. Just want to reiterate to everybody the threat of the thunderstorm is all because of that condensation that occurs and the heat that's generated inside the storm, causing it to grow. And then the upwards and downwards movement of air, the convection that occurs, creates all the enemies that you want. And any thunderstorm, even a little bitty tiny one, is still a storm that can kill you. And to give the thunderstorms wide berth, especially this time of year as we roll into the late summer and fall, where we really do have a lot of fronts that move along and the thunderstorms are associated with it. And then I'll be back a little bit later to talk about onboard radar. Diane, I'll pass it to you.
So we have several good questions here, Joe, that were put up while you were speaking. So this is a good one. You're in busy airspace, you're being vectored. Salil brought this one up, and there are buildups. And is there a good rule of thumb in terms of the height of the cloud, like from not AGL from the ground, but like the actual size of the cloud, the height, that you should probably tell ATC unable, you need to go around it versus flying through it?
Well, yeah, anything that looks cauliflower. Let me go back here. Let me see if I can go back to a picture I had. Hang on 1 second. Let me see if I can do it.
And often those buildups pop up before the ATC can see them on basically their version of NextRav. So
that's exactly right. I mean, you're talking about an updraft inside of a storm can easily get to 100 miles an hour of updraft inside the storm. So to give out a number to say, oh, I'm at 5,000, or let's go, I'm at 10,000 feet, and an innocuous small cloud below you can easily grow up into you. And so if it's developing, now this is not the greatest picture, but if you look at the top of this or the side of this, these are real cauliflower looking sort of clouds here. And what that means is that the storm is growing very rapidly. There's a crisp line from the blue to the white. And what this means is that this is really growing fast. If you look over here, this depicts it fairly nicely. They're sort of wispy, and it's kind of not a sharp break, but kind of a lesser break. Well, this over here is going to be any kind of cloud that has this kind of a picture is going to be more, it's not going to have a lot of convection in it. So you wouldn't want to fly anywhere near this, but let's say that anything of a supercell size. What I'm more discussing is how this cloud looks. That cauliflowery looking sort of a bulging, that's if it looks like that, it's growing and growing fast. If it looks wispy like this, then it's not. So if you were down in this area, see if you look at this is technically not part of that big supercell, and it might be 20 miles away, but you can see how this looks cauliflowery down at the bottom. That is going to, and even if you come out the other side, it's still going to be such an uncomfortable ride that to me, I've grown to just request with ATC that, hey, I want deviations left and right, and put it in heading mode and go to working around the storms.
And Joe, if I can, if they're vectoring me and I see a vector 20 degrees right or left of what they've suggested, I don't hesitate to say, how about 340? Try to give the controllers a leg up there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. At the end of the day, the controllers, if you're helpful with them, they'll be helpful with you. Usually, at the end of the day, gosh, guys and girls, y'all on the airplane, and it's your fanny that's in that seat. So don't fly into anything that you If you don't think you should fly into it, you probably shouldn't be flying into it.
So does the anvil always go in the direction of the storm path?
It goes with the upper levels of the wind, the winds at the upper level. So the anvil is caused by the upper level winds that blow it off to the side. And that does tell you the direction that it's moving. Incidentally, strong winds at the upper level help develop a better or a bigger storm, because it basically takes that moisture and moves it off and allows there to be a higher updraft within the storm. So if you really see a storm getting blown off to one side, that's one where you really can get the hail. I wish I had a good video to show it, but a lot of times you'll find in Texas these smaller, they're not huge storms. They don't cover a whole area, but they're smaller, just small cells that have a real sharp, if you look at radar, it goes from nothing to, green to yellow to red to purple to white very, very rapidly. And those little small cells, boy, those can be the ones that just throw out a gob of hail and lots of lightning. And, usually those aren't the gust front, big cells that produce the straight line winds or tornadoes, but they can sure mess you up in terms of hail and lightning.
Hey,
So, go ahead, Travis.
Do you use the wind arrow when you're working on flanking weather or looking out the window?
Absolutely. Yeah. Knowing where the wind arrow is a great way to look at the storm and determine where it's going. Absolutely.
So if you found yourself in severe turbulence or you inadvertently penetrated the cell, what is your response? What do you do?
Well, there's a laundry list of things that you need to be thinking about. The first one is slow down. I'll tell you, the PA-46 has rugged landing gear. If you were to throw the gear out at V&E and just about any PA-46, the worst thing that's going to happen is maybe one of the gear doors will get damaged a little bit, or maybe one of the, up in the nose, the gear doors might get damaged, but you're not going to hurt anything major. But what you are going to do is slow down. You need to slow down. And if you're, forget any kind of shock cooling ideas or save my engine or any of that, you've got to slow down if you get into a thunderstorm. You must get below VA, and really you need to be lower than that, because if you have a gust, that could cause the airspeed to go above the VA and hurt your airplane. So number one by far is slow down. Number two, turn all your interior lights on. And because whenever you get the flashes of lightning around you, it's going to be it's going to be a very bright cockpit there for spurts of time. The other one is maintain an attitude, not an altitude. You will be unable to maintain an altitude. You will be potentially able to maintain an attitude. So, but it will be the ride of your life. If I can divert just a little bit and talk about a time that there's two times that that really sunk home for me on the thunderstorm front. One was I was in a Citation airplane, and I was pretty high, probably 32 or 33,000 feet, and had the radar going and everything. I thought I was just fine with no worries whatsoever. Had good equipment, had the radar trained down, which I'll talk about in the next class. Really thought I was in good shape, but all of a sudden a cell grew from below me and caught up with me. And when I did, it was a violent move. Unfortunately, there was a lady in the back of the airplane that wasn't strapped in, and she didn't hurt herself. She hit the ceiling, came flying back down. It scared the padoodle out of everybody in the airplane. It was probably no more than 10 seconds. It wasn't bad in terms of time, but it was 10 seconds of what I would say sheer terror as everybody on the airplane. It was absolutely horrific. And an event like that, if you survive it, will be, it'll be the last time you ever go flirt with a thunderstorm. I had one other time flying a Meridian that I ended up flying from Oklahoma down to Texas, and that Meridian, and same thing, I was in an embedded area, thought I had everything wired tight and looking good, but again, a cell came from below and it wasn't a bad one, but again, I was already slow, I was already okay, but that was about 5 years ago, and gosh, ever since then I've been preaching the gospel of just stay away from the thunderstorms, and I've done a pretty good job of that, and I think it's going to help me be an old non-bold pilot, if that makes sense. Travis, can I ask you, you got any thunderstorm stories to tell, or anything that you'd be willing to tell that would help people out at all?
Well, my perspective is a little more from the turboprop side of the PA-46 world, but getting the gear down and keeping the engine spooled up, to me, is the best way to be in a place you don't want to be, because trying to get the turbine PA-46s down to VA minus 20, and John Mariani's words still ring in my ear that, VA only saves you until the gust comes, and VA minus 20 is what's going to save you in the gust. Trying to get that speed down to 110 knots with the gear up is such a nose up deck angle, it's a little bit uncomfortable. So I find, gear down, VA minus 20 knots, take off all the positive modes of the autopilot, so you're just in pitch and roll, and spend the next few moments remembering why you're not going to be there again the next time you go flying. So
yeah.
So you mentioned, Joe, about the anvil being particularly where there can be some, it can be a bad place to be. William asked, I was circumventing a thunderstorm and had about a 20-mile wide anvil, tops at 280, bottoms at 220, ATC, limited deviation. So he chose a descent to avoid the anvil. So what is in the anvil? And you should not consider flying through it, correct? And does that 20-mile rule still apply?
Yeah, 20 miles of rule still applies, and the big threaders there is the lightning and the hail. And the hail usually is going to be thrown from the storm on the forefront of the storm, so the direction the storm is moving. So there can be two sides of the anvil, the forward and the back side, because just think of the tropopause kind of being a lid to the atmosphere and not wanting the thunderstorm to grow. So that moisture has to grow out. It has to go outwards. Now, when it goes outwards, it's really losing its upward velocity, but then it can be gaining its downward velocity. And the hail that's being thrown up into the storm has to have somewhere to go as well. And so it's usually thrown to the front side with the upper level winds that move it out to the front. So the front of or the overhang, as some people will call it, especially near the storm, is a bad place to be. So yes, stay away from the anvil as well. It's still a part of the thunderstorm.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and switch gears here again so we can keep on track. I appreciate that, Joe. Thank you. We're going to go back and talk about radar in a few minutes. So I'd like to kick it over to Travis now to talk about density altitude. And having been in the mountains this summer, I'm telling you that I felt density altitude in a very personal way when I was hiking up a hill. So let's talk a little bit about that. Go ahead and take it over.
Hey, well, yeah, density altitude is serious, and it's more than just feeling stupid in the cockpit sometimes. Different density altitude. All right. So, we all came from smaller aircraft in our aviation history before we flew the PA-46, and we're lucky because in both the piston and the turbine flavors of the PA-46, we do have compression in the engine compartment. Unfortunately, we're still faced with the wing and propeller that is not anything but normally aspirated. So some basics. Temperature can increase your density altitude by 2,000 to 3,000 feet during typical summer conditions in the US. So here's just some rule of thumb: 6,000 feet at 80 Fahrenheit or 27 Celsius. It's going to put that density altitude up to 8,600 feet. And even our turbine aircraft are struggling in those conditions. Sea level, 90 Fahrenheit, 1,900 foot. So in high humidity conditions, we're going to add also about another 10% to the density altitude. So it's pretty easy to be facing a 9,000 foot density altitude on an afternoon takeoff from Colorado, and that can double your takeoff roll. In addition to the takeoff roll issues, we also got climb performance issues. So what can we do to help mitigate the hazards of density altitude in our PA-46 aircraft? First, reduce the takeoff weight, right? Depart early in the morning when we got lower temperatures. Both of these things are just going to give our aircraft more performance, increase our safety margin. Then, if we do need to worry about terrain, let's do a maximum performance takeoff using our short field technique, 20-degree flaps, get the plane up and off the ground. And then if en route terrain is a concern, we're going to climb up over the departure airport. So a flaps 20 VX plus 15 knots will give you about 95 knots in a traffic pattern climb to 1,000 foot AGL. And then clean the airplane up and climb at VY 110 knots until you got 3,000 foot AGL. Using the 3,000 foot threshold before you leave an airport environment is going to give you a lot more safety margin when we're flying in difficult conditions. And let's think about the mountains are not just high density altitude. We also have up and down drafts to work with too. Stay coordinated with adequate rudder. Your right leg might get a little bit sore during this climb out over the airport, but your passengers in the back will be very grateful that you're keeping the ball centered. And no more than 30-degree bank. That probably goes without saying, but I'm going to mention it anyway. At 30 degrees, we're losing 7% of our lift. At 45 degrees, we're losing 21% of our lift. So no more than 30-degree bank while we're trying to climb up around the airport here. So another important thing to remember about high density altitudes is that VX is a sea level number. So we can't use VX to get our best angle of climb when we're trying to outclimb terrain or trying to climb in challenging conditions. The midpoint of VY and VX in clean configurations is going to give us our best overall obstacle clearance. These are in high density altitudes. So book VX is going to be unsafe and slow if you're trying to clear terrain in higher density altitudes. So we publish VY and VX for our aircraft as 110 and 90 knots. And 100 knots is a nice midpoint number to be used for clearing en route terrain. But if we're doing this flaps 20 climb out to get that first 1,000 feet, let's remember that our numbers reduce about 5 knots with each notch of flaps. So VY flaps 20, sea level, 100 knots, and VX flaps 20 of 80 knots. So again, let's think about the midpoint of those numbers, 90 knots wings level in flaps 20, or 95 knots in a traffic pattern in high density altitudes are going to give you safer results than climbing at the book VX number of 80 knots with flaps 20. We don't want to be too slow to clear the terrain. And VX is a sea level number, so it's just critical we remember that we need to be a number higher than VX in these conditions. By climbing up over the airport, hopefully we give ourselves some extra safety margin and confidence so that we can maintain good performance of the aircraft. One more thing to think about when we're flying in the terrain is we always want to approach higher terrain at a 45-degree angle with an escape pathway pre-planned. It's not uncommon to have mountain wave and downdraft near the ridge that'll exceed the climb requirements, climbability of even the turbine PA-46 aircraft. Never forget this scary time coming out of Payne Field, Everett. And I was really excited because we had 120 knot tailwinds that day going to the east. And as we're climbing out over the Cascades, we got to 110 knots and 0 feet per minute in a turboprop. So this means that we were in like 1,500 foot per minute downdrafts and, you know, only with vertical speed mode. So we just got to be extra careful whenever you're climbing in the vicinity of terrain to give yourself lots of terrain clearance and give yourself an escape path. It's hard to believe people fly into controlled flight in terrain in VMC and VFR conditions, but every summer people are dying in the mountains. So let's enjoy the mountains safely.
We have a lot of questions, I think, going back to the thunderstorm and those things. Carl asks here, Travis, are the VX and VY speeds for the piston PA-46? Are the Meridian M500 speeds are VX 95 knots, VY 125 knots, correct?
Yeah, the numbers do vary between the different power plant or different variants, mostly due to the wing and the weight of the aircraft. But the constant change of the VY number decreasing by 5 knots for each additional notch of flaps, that holds.
Very good. Any other questions, guys, before we get on to the next topic? I think that that'll do it there. So with that, Joe, would you like to come back online with us, and let's finish up today's session with some discussion on radar, and then we'll open it up to kind of ask Travis and Joe anything to end the session.
I wanted to enter this discussion because I had I guess I've got a swimming pool in the backyard, and I'm at the very fortunate position in life to recently be a grandfather. And so I get to have my two young granddaughters over to my house fairly often with a swimming pool in the backyard. And I will tell you that where I used to have, people over and without much thought and care, I mean, I had some mild thought and care and concern. But when you've got two granddaughters that are young, very young, and how do you deal with that swimming pool? And the thought just came to my mind as I was there this is a whole lot like a thunderstorm, because this is the time of year when my granddaughters love to go swimming. They come over to our house. It's one of the first things they want to do, and we want to do it with them. But there's not a chance in the world I'm going to just open up the back door, shoo them out the door and say, y'all go jump in the pool and have a big time, because it would end horrifically. And a swimming pool in the backyard is sort of like that with young kids. And the point being that if you're gonna go there, you just got to be so careful, because a swimming pool where it's pretty and lovely and there for a good reason and enjoyable can turn into a deadly trap if it's under the wrong circumstance. I don't think I have to expound upon that anymore. But hopefully the metaphor, the analogy works there, that if you're going to flirt with a thunderstorm, and you're going to go near it, and you've got radar, you better know what you're doing. Yeah. And weather, weather is not linear. It's not where if you get this, you've got it all figured out. If you learn a little bit about condensation or whatever, you learn, gosh, it's such a deep, wide subject area. It's one where you can study for a long time and not have it all. There's a joke here about the woman and the man and not understanding the woman, but there's a lot to it in the sense that it's just such a deep subject. And when you think you've got it all figured out, you learn that you don't. And that the weather, we live in just such a wonderful, interesting world. And the weather that we have is so dynamic and so interesting that it's going to be hard for you to say, I've got it all figured out and I'm going to go play around near a thunderstorm, which is arguably, I think it is the worst that can be thrown at you. I think I would rather fly my airplane through a hurricane than a thunderstorm, even though the hurricane's going to have some thunderstorms within it. But the dangers within a thunderstorm are just so severe that you got to be careful. And I will tell you, for years of using radar, and even in some high-tech environments, in other words, I was an airline pilot for a while, I think my personal opinion is that using onboard radar is much more of an art than a science. It's a developed talent. It's something that it's not where you can go read a book and you're good at it. It's one where you need to know the subject matter, you need to know what to do, but knowing how to do it is this underground thing that you just got to be super careful. To say I own a radar and I had a 1-hour class or I went to a seminar, every time you decide you're going tactical, you are rolling the dice upon your knowledge and your ability. One of the things that I'm able to do is whenever I teach radar stuff to some of my clients, because there's some people that really do need to learn it and they need to understand, and they're going to use it, and they're flying a lot. If you fly a lot and you have a time frame, you're going to deal with thunderstorms at some point in time. And it's a wonderful tool. I really love it. But again, it's not going to be where you're just going to read something and you're good. What you need is this guy or this girl. And what I mean by that is all the other cockpits, not even all of them, but a lot of the other cockpits are 2-pilot aircraft where you have a hopefully an older, experienced mentor in the left seat. And in the right seat, you have you, where you're learning. I heard it said, there's a guy, Chad's an instructor that works for me. He made the quote the other day that where you really learn to fly is in the right seat. It's either as a co-pilot watching somebody work that knows what they're doing, or it's in the right seat as a flight instructor as you teach, because that's such a license to learn. But there's one of these two types of people that are out there. And what I mean by that is somebody that has weather experience in a crewed aircraft, that has a good radar, that is find that person, that if you don't know it, and it may not even be your instructor, your instructor might not be good at radar, but find that person that has learned the art of radar. So I hope I'm being careful about that and being able to describe it. As I was preparing my lesson, this was a recent flight that I had the option to fly. And it was on the day that I was preparing this lesson, and this was the radar image that I had. And what do you do with that? I'm going from over here from JSO, and I'm going down here over to the Gulf Shores area, to Jack Edwards is where I was trying to go. And look at this mess down here below me, which is no big deal, but look over here, just a big thunderstorm mess. There's no chance that I'm going out over the Gulf and coming back in. Do I fly through this area right here and go tactical, or do I just simply fly around? And I will tell you, everybody in the PA-46 community, this is a hard pill to swallow, to fly up here and then come back down, because we're so efficiency oriented, and it would chap us to, gosh, I got to fly 30 degrees off course to go around. But when you fly 30 degrees off course to go around and then come down, I'll tell you that on a flight like this, which would probably be 2 hours and 20 minutes in a jet prop, would probably be 2 hours and 35 minutes if you just went around. And it's just not, those deviations are just never the big, huge problem that they look to be whenever you look at them with your efficient eye of, you want to get from A to B as quickly as you can. And this little gap right here looks just so inviting to be able to go through here. But what will happen in there? Will it close up? Are these storms bigger than they are? Is there enough room where you don't get hail or lightning? And it's just so difficult. But this ability to go around a storm is just so important. And I hope everybody gets that from this discussion, that going around is the thing to do. Well, radar works by sending out energy. It sends out, in this case, it's red energy, and it measures the energy that comes back to the dish. So it sends out X amount of energy, and how much of that energy does it receive back? If it receives a lot of that energy back, then it's going to depict a certain color. If it receives a little bit, it'll be green, a little bit more yellow, a little bit more red, a little bit more purple, a little bit more white. And so it's just bouncing off of something, anything. In this case, a shaft of precipitation is perfectly fine, and it'll bounce off that and come back to the radar dish. I will tell you, the radar dish is everything. The size of the radar dish, the bigger the dish, the better off it is. And in the PA-46 community, there's still a few, not very many, but a few of those weather scout radars that are in-wing radars, which are virtually useless. If you've got one of those, you got to be so close to a storm, but by the time you get there, it tells you it's there. It's of no value at all. If you got one of those, just take it out of the wing, in my opinion. But otherwise, you've got the bigger dishes that are under wing, and they're not bad. It's and some of them, like in the new M600, are really quite exceptional. So having a good radar, if you're going to use it, is a great thing to have. But it's all about that dish and how big that dish is, and how good the receiving of that of those electromagnetic waves are. That's what it's sending out energy, bouncing off something, and then returning back to the radar dish and then telling you what it is. So here's what you need to do, in my opinion. I'm making this very simplistic, I hope, is what I want to, and you're just getting a glancing view of this, but the meat and potatoes of a thunderstorm, I'm depicting it in the blue way over here, and starting at about 7,000 is how I depicted it. You want to aim the radar, that's a good way to think about it, at somewhere in the 20,000 foot area. And basically just train it up. So if I'm at low altitude, down near the ground, anything below 10,000 feet, just train the tilt of the angle up, certainly 10 degrees or greater. You have no chance of having ground clutter, and it will show you every storm that's out there that's within that area. So if you're at low altitude, train it up. That's a good way to think about it. That'll tell you everything that's going on above you. If you're at high altitude, and what I mean by high altitude, I depicted my bi-wing jet prop here at about 27,000 feet, or at least I tried to. Again, I want to shoot the radar downward to paint about half scale. It's a good way to think about it. And the reason why I tried to depict this little cell right here that's growing is the idea. And when you train it down, you have a chance of seeing that cell as it grows. If you're at high altitude and you don't train it down, you have a chance of having something grow up into you. And again, I had that happen to me twice, and it's a terribly uncomfortable place to be. And how to kill yourself at high altitude is to shoot your radar straight ahead, thinking everything's fine, but you're not looking down at this cell that's growing up into you. And so it's you want to definitely, if you're at high altitude, aim it down. If you're at low altitude, aim it up. And if you're at mid altitudes, then you're going to kind of be in the middle. But what you're looking to do is paint about half scale. So I'm painting half scale with this. And to me, the 40 nautical mile view is almost the only view you need. There's a few times where a smaller view will help, but a larger scale, in other words, to go out to 80 is just not very much helpful in my opinion. And the reason why is we have downlinkable and ADSB radar that tells us how far out it is. But if you paint, when I say paint half scale, this is what I'm looking for, is to paint that weather so it paints at about half the scale of what we're looking. And this is all ground that's out here. And how do you tell the difference? Well, I'm making this animate now. You can see I was just painting back and forth and painting the mid-scale view. Right. This is what you don't want. This is what we call going tactical, where you got something on your right and something on your left, and you're betting all hope that this right here is where you can get through. I'm telling you, this right here is a recipe for disaster. This guy or girl, whoever's piloting this airplane, is in a world of hurt. And I'm talking about rolling the dice, and they don't have very many rolls. This is a disaster about to happen. You'll hear me talk about going tactical. And when we say going tactical, never go tactical without onboard radar. And here's the reason why. You simply can't trust downlinkable. This is a flight that I did real recently. It wasn't long ago at all, within the last 2 weeks. And it's near Paducah, Kentucky. But here's a good sized thunderstorm. And it looks like I'm right on top of it. And I'm going to play this video and let you watch it. So as it's going along here, you can see how it looks like the storm's to my left. But as I come up, I'm in the clear. And guess where that thunderstorm is? Way off to my right. And that is because the delay in that, and this is a King Air I'm flying, in case you're wondering what I'm doing there. But you could see how that, I'm gonna play that again. It looks like the weather is to my left, but whenever I play it, you can see that that whole system was moving so fast. That was real-time data right there, that the weather was actually way off to my right. And then, so now where I'm in the clear here, and that's all well and good and fine, what if this had been different? And what if I had been flying over here and thinking I'm in the clear, and that storm as it moved along just could have come right into me and really rocked my world. And this is a King Air. I'm gonna play that one more time just for fun. I'm at 33,000 feet, as I believe where I'm at, somewhere pretty stinking high in this King Air. And look at the clouds are still at 33,000 feet. They're still above me. So that gives you an idea. And that's just a run-of-the-mill thunderstorm, but that was plenty of a thunderstorm to rock your world as far as that's concerned. Now, the other thing that you want to do whenever you can see on this video, I'm painting half scale. And this is a real cell right here. But now watch what's going to happen with this cell. This is what we call marching. You're going to notice that cell is going to march toward me, meaning it's every time the radar sweeps, that cell, and this is actually up in Maine. I was flying an airplane over to Europe, and you can see it in a jet prop, and you can see how this cell is just marching toward me. So you notice how the green's not, but the cell actually is. So you can tell that that's a real cell by that moving towards me and just marching as it goes. And I'm maintaining about 20 miles berth from that particular cell. And so the other thing you're looking for is for your cells to march. When they start marching, you know you've got the real deal. And I put this picture up here as well because you can see how the radar, this cell's so large right here that it shadowed everything behind it. It was this was a picture that I looked at, or that I took not long ago in an Avidyne aircraft, and you can see how the radar simply can't see behind that. So that's a very real cell right there too. We were just about to make the turn to get away from that guy, for sure. And then one other thing I want to say about onboard radar that really works well is on takeoff. I don't have it depicted here, but it's a great picture. Otherwise, this is my airport, my little runway. On takeoff, just take that radar and aim it up as high as you can. Put it on the 40-mile scale or the 20-mile scale, and you can just literally see while you're on the runway what you're about to fly into. And I think it's a good thing to do on nearly every takeoff, just to get used to it. Just get used to doing that. Right before you launch, you just look at what you're fixing to run off into, even if it's clear weather. It's just a good habit to get into to get used to moving that radar around and putting it where in an intentional spot. And so those are the things that I think you need to do with radar. I was going to say as well, if y'all want to take a picture of that, these are some of the websites that I think are just kind of cool and neat. And there's a lot of other ones. I will tell you, we have today's flying in today's world of high technology is so much better than we used to have. We've got the capability today to just really see weather and see things like we could never do before. So I'm a big fan of the onboard radar. I'm a big fan of the downlinkable radar, but let me just say it again, loud and clear. If you're using the onboard radar, get somebody to come help you learn the art of running that radar before you go anywhere near a thunderstorm. There you go. And I'll pass it back to you for any questions.
All right, thanks, Joe. So there's one question, Christopher
Check mute,
asked.
Diane.
What's that? Can you hear me?
Check your mute. Oh, hang on. Try it again. Say it again, Diane.
I think I'm with you guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's my mute that was down.
So when you're flying high and pointing down, how do you distinguish from the ground from developing weather?
Yeah, the ground doesn't march at you. That was I was saying. The ground won't march. The ground will stay there. Now that can if you're flying in the mountains and you have a big mountain in front of you, and anything that radar needs to bounce off of. So if you get in the mountains, there can be a little bit of difference, but you should kind of know a mountain's there if you're flying in the mountain anyway. But anywhere east of the Rockies is the ground won't march. That's the big one. The marching that we were looking for is going to be real weather.
And someone asked about those websites again, so we'll get those posted back up. Do you want to put those back up real quick, Joe, so we can just take another quick look for everybody?
Sure. You bet. You keep going as I'll.
Yeah, actually, as you're doing that. So let's see.
By the way, this first website that I've got right here is one of the coolest videos of thunderstorm sequences I've ever seen. I just think that's the coolest thing ever. I use Wonderground and windy.com all the time. Those are kind of in my wheelhouse of places to go. This weather wrap is good. This weather depiction is my favorite geek out website. And my lightning info came partially from here. I wanted to provide some numbers so that people would actually believe my 30,000 a day and millions, of thunderstorms a year. I thought I'd get some people to book me on that. So I thought I'd throw that out there just so they'll know where I came from. But a really cool video right here, stuff I use all the time right here, and just some really neat websites right here as well.
So a question from David Young on a BK scope. What is the typical tilt below 10,000? He runs it, David says he runs it around 4.2 to 5.2. What's your thought there?
I don't look at the number as much as I would, in other words, like to say 4.2 to 5.2. I look more at is it presenting me the data that I want? So if you're running at 10,000, you're really in kind of that middle ground that's really hard to depict. You're not going to have a thunderstorm grow up into you from there. So looking down real far is not as important. I'd probably, that 4.2 to 5.2 probably sounds pretty close to where I would be. That'd probably give you a good depiction. If you just kind of think to yourself, if you aim at the 20,000 foot arena at about the 20 to 40 mile area, and again, you can geek out on these things and do angles and all kind of things. They're really great to understand from a layman's point of view, from how do I use this radar if I'm not using it all the time? What I really want to do is I want to fly. One more thing that I should have said, and I didn't say it. The number one radar on your airplane is your eyeballs. And for the longest time, you need to fly in a place where you can look outside and get above the weather if you possibly can, and practice making that radar image look like what your eyeballs see. And as you can progressively make that image look like what your eyeballs see, that's going to give you the confidence to be able to do what you need. So it's not whether it's 4.2 to 5.2, am I making what I'm seeing outside? One of the last things you want to do is not be very good at radar and fly in embedded thunderstorms. The idea where you're in the clouds, you can't see a thing, but there's convection all around. That's a recipe for disaster. Go out there and fly, not around thunderstorms, but be able to make that image that you're seeing as you're flying around, as you're avoiding them, look like what your eyeballs see. That is going to be the place that you're getting good.
So we all know thunderstorms can throw out hail. So does onboard radar detect that?
Onboard radar will detect anything that it bounces off of. So if it can bounce off the radar and shoot back to you, yes. If it cannot, then no. In other words, if there's not enough hail for it to do that. But if there's something there that it bounces off of, it's going to come back to you. You want to avoid that. That's especially if it's coming back in a yellow, red, or greater return.
The 20 miles too is key. The 20 miles from the radar return is going to get you clear of the hail and all the garbage coming off of that storm. Right, so
that's right.
So does that somebody mentioned, I think Stuart actually asked this, so do you ever vary that 20-mile rule depending on the speed of the storm or the direction of the storm?
I always try to flank the weather upwind whenever possible. And if I have to flank that weather downwind, 20 miles is really a minimum. I'm looking for closer to 50 because I know that storm's coming at me while I'm trying to get around it. And if I'm a 200 knot true airspeed aircraft and that storm's moving at 50 knots, you need to give it some extra space.
Yeah, and remember, a moving storm is always going to be a stronger storm. So you really got to be careful with those moving storms for sure. And again, use the downlinkable radar for just avoiding the area of the storm. I kind of made it sound like downlinkable is not useful. Downlinkable is very useful to get a good picture of what the overall weather patterns look like and to stay away from it. It's the radar really has its benefit if you're going to go tactical, but again, be real careful doing it. And you're not going to hear me go into the average PA-46 pilot and saying, hey, Joe said go jump in, go tactical. It's not what I said. Make sure you know exactly what you're doing. You have mentorship, and you've become very good at the art of making that radar screen look like what your eyeballs see.
So what about turbulence? Can radars pick up turbulence?
Right, Travis?
Oh, I would just, you asked about radar and turbulence, but I was going to say the very best feeling I ever get is when I use the downlink weather to avoid needing the onboard radar altogether. That's, you know, my victory moments.
Good point. The turbulence question, I don't know for sure. For me, I'm not good enough at the radar to be able to tell you about turbulence. I don't use it for such, if there is such a way, but I don't know how to do it if it is.
I think of the old mark on the weather charts, you know, that CB implies severe turbulence, icing, and uncomfortable conditions, right?
Right.
WL asked Joe, if you're flying above smooth clouds that ultimately has embedded up-down drafts, will the radar pick up those embedded cells?
Yes, it will. It's bouncing off of. Think of it this way: when it's shooting out that radar energy, that electromagnetic energy, it has to bounce off something. So if you're just in a cloud, then there's just vapor. There's not much to bounce off of. But whenever you have a thunderstorm, you have a concentration of water, of where the water's thick and it's not just vapor. And so it has something to bounce off of. And so, yes, it will show you those. By the way, WL, it's his airplane that was on the recent cover of MMOPA magazine. And it is a great picture. So thanks, WL, for that.
Yes, thank you. Any good hints with dealing with embedded, this is again, embedded thunderstorms, if you only have radar and you're in IMC, how far out can you detect them?
Well, if you're an embedded thunderstorm, if you're an embedded convective area and you only have radar, go buy downlinkable radar and go get you have no business being up there without all the tools. So go get the tools. I don't care if it's, I guess I do like downlinkable a little bit better, but because the ADSB is a little fuzzier, but the fuzzy ADSB still gives you plenty of idea of where the storms are generally to just avoid the whole area. Again,
Only works on one of the 6 continents, though, Joe.
That's true. That's true. I will agree. And I will say that there are times where ADSB, as much as I do like having it, there's times where ADSB doesn't work, meaning there's like gaps in the coverage or where it just doesn't seem that I get the information as quickly as I want it. And so I think I'm still at the place where I like XM radio or downlinkable radar of some sort. It's very, very valuable. But going back to this, the embedded thunderstorm, embedded means you're totally dependent upon what you're looking at. And I'll tell you, one of the things I do if I'm training somebody with radar in a training event of some sort is I'll literally go up to high altitude and block the screen where they can't look outside at all. And the pucker factor skyrockets when you can't look out there with your eyes and see what's out there. So the idea of an embedded thunderstorm, and you need all your tools, all your capability, everything you've got, and the knowledge of how to use it that's the worst case scenario right there. Yeah, that's the worst case scenario right there.
So the question is, what we thought, we've all been taught that, you have to be careful with the radar and when you're using it on the ground because of the danger to others. So what are you suggesting there in terms of when you turn it on before takeoff? Are you saying as you're lined up for takeoff, is that when you turn it on, or kind of what's your process?
Put it on standby and taxi out and kind of get it all ready to go. But whenever you get on the runway, especially if you think there might be something out there, turn it on when you're out there near the runway, not pointed at anybody, not when you take the runway. You can't do it every time, and be wise about it. Don't fry your lineman or anything, but you be wise about it. So
down at the departure end of the runway, before you turn onto the runway while you're still on the taxiway, I find single pilot is a great time for me to turn on the radar.
So we've got about 5 minutes here, guys, or a little less than. Let's, any other questions? We'll try to get through a few of these. Let's see. Can you give, so someone's asking about power settings for the Malibu Mirage jet prop 500, 600 for thunderstorm penetrations. And I think what was the rule of thumb that you mentioned earlier, Travis? You had the Mariani rule.
Oh, gear down and 400 pounds of torque in the jet prop, 500 in the in the meridian and about 25 inches in the piston. So the goal is VA minus 20 knots, but everything is going to be bouncing and shaking at that moment. You just want a power setting and a configuration that gets you in the neighborhood.
I call those escape torques or escape power settings. They're great power settings. Like if you just lose your situational awareness, the bell's going off that you don't really know. It's just those are great power settings. They're going to put you right in the low to middle part of the green, and that's what I call them, escape torques. And it's just a good number that you always ought to have in the back of your brain, that if something goes wrong, pull back to that, figure it out, then adapt, overcome.
Question for you, Travis. Do you use the takeoff mode on the flight director for guidance on takeoff in the mountains?
Yes, I do. In larger aircraft, that takeoff mode gives you a positive measurable rate of climb with an engine failure at the most critical moment. So I'm it's ingrained into me to use that at all times. But yeah, in the mountains, I'm still pitching for those pitch bars, and then I'm cleaning the airplane up, gear up, and then I'm looking for my speed. But before the gear is up, a measurable positive rate of climb is my objective. So I am using the takeoff bars on the go.
A couple people mentioned this one. So opinion on storm scope. We didn't really talk about that. And I know it's still a tool in a lot of airplanes out there.
It is still out there, and it is another tool to help you. I am not, matter of fact, on that storm scope right next to it, it says not to be used for thunderstorm penetration area or something of this nature. I mean, it's telling you straight up, don't use this thing to go into an area. But if I've got a storm scope and I have downlinkable and I have radar and I know how to use every one of them, it's going to tell you something that may be helpful. So I probably wouldn't get rid of it, but again, that is not going to be my primary to go anywhere near a thunderstorm.
It's a great confirmation, though. Additional information about what you're seeing on the radar is actively sparking, so it's a good third piece of information, I think.
Let's hear. Lightning and clear air. Yes, it happens. Is there a way to avoid it?
Stay 20 miles away from a thunderstorm or a volcano or a bunch of other things that are going to spew things rapidly up in the air.
And I got picked off by a low density roll cloud, so the circular looking cloud out there, it was going on for a long distance. It didn't have a lot of density in me. And then the storm scope became one giant bright spot.
So just to clarify, when you're flying it in the flight level, so it's 260, 270, do you still recommend staying at that 40-mile range?
I do, because I'm using Downlinkable for all the long distance stuff. So.
And outside the US, I use the 80 when I don't have any downlink. And then as soon as I see something, I'm coming back to the 40 for wishing I wasn't that close to it.
Great. Okay, we're going to try to grab one more question here. Do you guys see any that you'd like to quickly answer on the list there? Takeoff flaps on 20-degree flaps for shorter takeoff would be better on a high, hot, short runway, assuming no takeoff and obstructions or terrain. What's your thoughts there on takeoff flaps?
Well, flaps reduce the takeoff roll, but they add drag. So if you have an unlimited runway and no obstacles, then the additional flaps aren't helping you. I was recommending more discussing about taking off from terrain constrained airports where you got mountains in all directions and you want to circle up over the airport. But yeah, so flaps shorten the takeoff roll, but they actually hurt your climb performance once you're airborne.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time, guys. There was some questions about some of the information that were on you guys' slide decks. We are going to be posting this presentation in the Resource Center in a few days, about a week's time. Give us a little time to get that on there. We will, so you'll be able to reference that. We can also publish these slide decks with you guys' permission. I think there's a question of some things on both of your decks, so I'd like to be able to provide that. We're going to push a poll out here in a second for you guys to let us know. Give us your thoughts on how you feel about the session. Always leave that feedback. Also, you do get Wings credit for today's session, so If you attended the entire thing, I already have that information captured and we'll submit that for you. Thank you, Dave McBenney, for taking care of that. Also, just a quick reminder, please make sure that you get registered for the MMOPA 2020 Live. Since we can't do the convention in person, we're gonna do a virtual event. It's gonna be live from Vero Beach, from Piper Aircraft. It's gonna be really fun. Kirby Chandler is gonna host. It's gonna be a mixture of pre-recorded sessions, but also I'll broadcast live for 3 days. MMOPA.com/convention, get yourself registered. Even if you can't attend the entire thing, you'll have access, unlimited access in perpetuity to all the sessions, so you can go back and watch them as many times as you like. And with that, I'd like to thank Travis. I'd thank you, Joe, for today's session. This was awesome. A lot of great information. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And this was just a fantastic event.